congratulations for making it this far.
Hello everyone, my name is Grace. Welcome to the quarters. Best of luck to everyone.
Okay, with the intros done, hopefully you guys already have the motion. We're going to be using, of course, wild schools format. That simply means there's going to be a provision for engagement within the substantive speeches. You're going to be using strictly 8 minutes of speech, not in round prep, 4 minutes for reply speech. Guys, please, I highly encourage speakers to pick a POI or two, even when I may not penalize you for it, but for purposes of engagement or for the debate to necessarily flow, please pick a POI or two. Guys, please be respectful of your fellows' preferred gender pronouns, and be respectful of their preferred POI period. Sorry, their preferred POI time. Please don't badger if a speaker doesn't pick you. Please hold your horses. It's really disrespectful. Be as respectful as you can be. With that said, then we have the first proposition. Speaker, write out the motion so that we can start. Also, I'm going to be running an external timer, but I highly encourage speakers to as well run their personal timers. So with that said, let's have the first proposition. Speaker, write out the motion here.
Yeah. So for this round, just give me a second to get it.
Speaker, you want to move to a place that has better network connection? Because you are...
the motion for the... okay. The motion for this round is this house would break up big religion.
Helena, if you're trying to speak, you are inaudible.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to start my speech now. Let me just set up my time and then I'll begin. In case I'm not audible, one of my teammates should just text me in WhatsApp. All right. I think for an opening statement to just be rather a question. Because of how widespread religions and these doctrines are, do they deserve to have that much power without the fact that they're elected? Given that you prove or you justify why they don't deserve this power, is what wins this debate from side proposition, but secondly, proving why the counterfaction becomes much better. However, on opposition, they also prove why a non-elected leader or non-elected doctrines that aren't agreed by society deserve to remain at the point in time at which we prove that they are probably harmful. Very proud to propose. I think the first piece of framing that I want to do is on what exactly this big religion looks like. Big religion, these are doctrines that are actively widespread by virtue of the Infoslide that we get and everything. These are widespread doctrines that influence a large number of people. The idea of indoctrination is that people are coerced into believing these things, into believing specific aspects of the religions. Why is that then important? What exactly does a coercive power then look like? It then looks like the implication is that firstly, it biases a lot more people to believe that it is good, that even in the event that there are things that they don't believe in, things like food taboos and everything, the idea is that they're biased into believing that these things are good. Secondly, because they're based on things like morality and everything, people are less likely to do things such as question them, because probably a lot more people buy into morality or believe in morality as a good thing. But thirdly, because these are things that are justified by things like divine, power and everything, things that people were probably unable to comprehend and everything, they become much more coercive because people are unlikely to do things such as question them. Why does that become extremely important within this debate? It means that there's much less accountability why doesn't accountability exist? And I think it's like the first argument that we're running. There's less incentive for you to do things like check these like classify and everything. Notice what the Infoslide tells you is that big religion holds a lot of power in things like societal pressures or even things like policy within like governments and everything. There are religious advisors that exist within a large number of like states and everything. Being that they exist within specific parts and they have a lot of like agenda setting power within those things, there's much less incentive to check because there's a fear of backlash that happens at a point in time at which you opt out of things like religious doctrines or probably what your priest, pastor, etc. is telling you. But B, because there's precedence that things like religion are good, things like religion are like entirely moral within status quo, it means you're more likely to be biased into doing things like opting in for them. That means even when a policy is created that's created actively marginalizes a large group of people, you're less incentivized to do things like probably question like the government and everything because it's backed up by things like religion. And even when you have the incentive, the preemptive fear of you being backlash for going against pastor so and so or reverend so and so actively deters you from questioning the thing within the very first place. But secondly, on principle, accountability doesn't exist because of the fact that they're not elected. Yeah, what political leaders do is that because of things like social contract and everything, or because of the utility that you get from being in power, which is entirely dependent on whether or not the citizens like you, it means you ought to opt into whatever it is that they want you to do. Being that those same mechanisms of accountability don't exist within religion, because this is something divine, it's something that somebody like like a specific deity that you believe in told you to do, it's more likely that you're not elected, and because your power is independent of the human being that exists on earth, it means you're less likely to be accountable. Even if that's not true, on principle, you have much less certainty of things like accountability because of individual incentives and the bare fact that like you're less likely going to have your power is like independent on whether or not human beings buy into you, because you probably don't have to conform to the standards of this world and whatever. Accountability becomes extremely important because it's how people maximize the utility that they get things from like leaders. Notice what I tell you is that you're unable to do things like question the policies that leaders give you. But even secondly, because they also actively opt into these religions as probably even mechanisms just appeal much better within society, you're less likely to do things like question leaders ability to start questioning leaders. Secondly, on the idea of like agency, and I think this is very, very important because of things like doctrine, things that you're actively like a very young age, that if you don't kneel within the Catholic Church, your mother probably beats you because those are the doctrines that you've grown up believing. And there's much less and there's very religion because they are probably laws that have been set from like biblical times or BC or like AC or whatever, or things that have been set in stone by the gospel or like the 10 Commandments. Everything accountable exists within like different religions and everything. There's a politicization. Then what does that then look like? It looks like a lot of people are separated because probably they feel they get a lot less, they got a lot more agency from like a specific religion because they get that agency from specific religions, and these are things that are actively challenged within each and every single religion because of things like division. Why does division become extremely bad? There's things like worsening relationships in status quo. But even secondly, even when leaders are trying to like appeal to specific people, it means they're probably going to do things like appeal to your like religious doctrines and everything. But still, on a general comparative way, you lose out on things like agency because these are things that are very coercive within society. You don't want to question them within the first place. Agency becomes important because it will actively like influences the choices that you make within your life. Being that you choose not to do things like eat meat because in the Old Testament it says that you shouldn't, it means you lose out on that utility. You lose out on like your individual choice that you have at the end of the day. What exacerbates this harm then is that if first of all the idea that you probably still have agency, but you still don't because you opt into specific doctrines that are extremely rigid, so they're not like set by you. But secondly, the fact that there are widespread beliefs and you probably fear being backward and like opting into like African traditional religion if you're trading off things like religion for culture and everything. You don't want to be looked at as backward or like as a witch of their everything. But these are secondly widespread beliefs which have a lot of buy-in within society. And then thirdly, things like the bandwagon effect, where you simply follow as like the sheep-like tendencies of like human beings, which actively make them opt into like the lack of agency. What then does the counterfactual then look like? Breaking them up becomes simple. Simply breaking them up, and there's a decentralization of the power that these big religions have within the very first place. How do we then get accountability? On the idea of like obligation. Obligation is extremely proximity dependent. That is to say, if I'm close to you or if our religion is community based, I'm more likely going to be accountable to you simply because you're probably like close to me, or like we're all affected by the same doctrines within this religion. Obligation becomes important because it's proximity dependent. I think this is a principle that all of us like running within this. But even secondly, the scope of whatever harms come out of religion on things like loss of agency, or probably even things like coercion, become much more minimal. Why? I think there's more likelihood that you're able to do things like change, and you become like much less rigid by virtue of the fact that you
TOA.
exist within smaller communities, everything protected time. But even secondly, because it's centralized, you exist within much more that we have. I think what analytics that becomes very important from our side of the house is the fact that you probably get some lack of accountability, but even secondly, you lose that on agency because of the doctrine that exists in religion.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for the fine speech. Let's have the first speaker from Negative Bench here.
Yeah, can I be heard?
Um, yes, you're audible.
Okay, cool. Guys, I encourage you to ask for POI and stuff. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to begin shortly. Let me just get split screen for a timer. Cool. I'm going to start the speech. Wait, 8:15. Cool. I'm going to start the speech in 3, 2, 1. I think there's a very important thing that needs to exist in this debate, and that's the idea of perception. If one does not see a harm, if one does not perceive something as bad, I don't think there is need to force them to perceive that thing as bad. Never been more proud to oppose. Lastly, I just want to get on quickly with the engagement. The first piece of analysis they give us is on accountability. They say there largely exists a lack of accountability because of a fear of backlash. There are three responses to this. Firstly, what they are alluding to systems that actively harm people that don't have accountability are theocracies. We say that within status quo, theocracies exist to a very small minimal extent. The debate is not about theocracies. The debate is about religion. We say structures like theocracies are the minority and they're the ones that set up policies that harm people. We don't support those things. But then secondly, a lack of accountability exists within all structures. That is to say, even if I'm in a liberal democracy, even if I'm in any state in the world, there is there is a lack of accountability because there are mechanisms that exist for people to backlash against me regardless. Even if you want to argue on magnitude of backlash, I think backlash for challenging government systems is going to exist on either side of the house. That's not something that can win you the debate. But then thirdly, on perception, and this becomes very important. If people have a strong inkling to certain moral standards and policies where like religion has a lot of influence and those policies come from religion, most likely align with those moral standards. If people don't perceive those things as harmful and they're generally okay with it, it means you ought not to force them not to be okay with it. I don't think that can win the debate. But then secondly, on agency. So I just want to flip this chart on agency quickly. This is how agency works in religion. Yes, we concede that there are manipulative structures that do exist to force people to opt into religion. Those things do exist. We concede to that. But I say the trade-off is significantly worse. That is to say, the systems that exist to help people gain some sort of actualization in society, aside from religion, are far less fulfilling. In as far as we need systems that are fulfilling for people to perceive this world properly, we don't think that's a problem. But then secondly, if I opt into the religion and I'm okay with it, I don't see why it's a bad thing. They're not able to show why the policies that exist within places like Uganda that are largely influenced by religion are then bad for people. I just think those are things that exist in any sort of government structure. That can't be the debate. So this is the chart you're going to get from our side. Firstly, I'm going to show you why when you break up big religions, you get small groups of religions that actively dilute the structure of religion with subjective interpretations. The premise of this argument is simple. We say that when religions become smaller and much more community-based, there are larger incentives for these smaller groups of religion to care about buy-in, and that actively harms religious structures. Three things here. Firstly, we say to a large extent, the financial capacity of these religions is tied to how best they can please their community. That is to say, they are most likely going to compromise their ideals because they want to get more money in these particular instances. But then secondly, when the small groups become numerous, there's an active competition that exists within these communities themselves. We think that this creates a ripple effect of people trying to please people more instead of like sharing the value of religion and keeping those doctrines set in stone and those principles existing. I think this creates more dilution and creates a higher likelihood for subjective and really malleable interpretations for religions to exist. But then thirdly, and this is very important, there exists little to no checks and balance mechanisms from formal hierarchies that exist within like the larger organizations of religion. What this means then is that religious organizations are going to face significantly less accountability for by diluting those structures. Therefore, they are more likely going to dilute those structures. Why is this actively a bad thing? Context. The structures that exist within religion that hold religious coalitions get together, that hold religious coalitions together actively get diluted, and that's morally abhorrent. But then secondly, these are the structures that actively help people to interpret this world and largely inform their decision making. So what are these structures? I think they look like three things. Firstly, it's a veneration and the charismatic nature of these leaders, the reverence you have for these leaders and how these leaders carry themselves. But then secondly, there is largely a promise of interpersonal fulfillment that would exist within these systems. Thirdly, it's a very strong allegiance to the religious group that exists only when you have like a larger religious organization existing. Why is it that breaking big religion dilutes these structures? There are actively two reasons. Firstly, the smaller churches are going to be open, like the smaller religious groups are going to be open to more discourse and become much more be like much more progressive. Firstly, because they don't have already like pre-existing relevance, but then secondly, the extent to which they can actualize is largely based on their buy-in. It means they become much more malleable and much more fixated on trying to align themselves with people's ideals that doesn't actually help anyone. But then secondly, the increase in malleability and flexibility in those systems that exist on their side significantly changes the bedrock principles that exist within religion. I want to flag why this is important. The bedrock principles that exist within religion are the systems that help people gain some sort of fulfillment within religion. For example, when you have a lot of malleability within religious structures, you largely dilute things like the promise to interpersonal fulfillment. You largely get leaders open to more questioning and more discourse and the likes. If you're able to break down those structures that hold religion together, you largely have no religious coalition existing. When you have no religious coalition existing, you largely deny people things like interpersonal fulfillment, and you largely deny people ability to perceive the world in a way that is much more beneficial, like God has my back and God is going to do it all for me. When these things exist, there's a very big mental implication of people. That is to say, people get much more stress, people get much more anxiety, and we actively think that's a bad thing. Because to interpret the world that is filled with a lot of suffering and all these things, you need these things, you need these systems to support you. Before I go into the way up and the comparative, I want to take a PY. 3, 2,
Protected time.
it shows it's not protect. Anyway, cool. Yeah, I guess my password timer is wrong. So let's get into the way up. Firstly, sustainability of individuals. I think it's largely not sustainable for individuals to exist within structures that are highly malleable, especially when we're chatting about religion. This is because when these systems keep on changing, there is no strong belief system I can fall back to when things actively go bad. When things actively go bad and there's no sustainable structure that exists for me to be in, I actively become more stressed, I get more anxious, and it harms me on the long term. But then, secondly, I think religious institutions have an institutional obligation to care about people and help people like perceive the world better. If those structures that help people perceive the world better get broken, we say it breaks the institutional obligation that religious systems have. We largely think that people ought to feel better. People's happiness is important. If you break the structures that make people happy, make people feel good, you harm people on their side. We're not willing to defend that on opposition. Here.
Okay, thank you so
Okay.
much for your fine speech. Let's have second affirmative.
Okay, I hope I'm audible. Okay, without response, I'll assume I am audible. My speech starts in 3, 2, 1. Panel, notice for side opposition to be right into the debate. And that's what is that? That is that things such as tribe, my ethnicity, sexuality, and any other unique difference I have within the debate does not matter, and I owe my full allegiance to religion, right? Now, panel, this is going to lead me to our new argument in the debate, and that's also going to be like
Ntegeka, you want to be a lot more clear?
okay, give me a okay, is this better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, can I restart my timer?
Yeah, sure thing.
Okay. Notice, pan, for side opposition to be right in this debate, one thing has to be true, and that is other things of diversity, such as my tribe, sexuality, ethnicity, historical context, don't matter, and I owe my full allegiance to my religion, right? Now, that's going to lead me to, first of all, respond to like their first case, which is the perception of harm, which is also going to lead into like the new argument from side proposition, which is the suppression of individual autonomy, right? Now, and what is the premise to this argumentation, right? Number one, that comes with the framing of the debate, right? Oftentimes, big religions have uniform interpretations of what's good and right, moral or divine interpretation, right? So now, you have to understand by the time this particular what belief goes against something such as my tribe, such as what my ethnicity, sexuality, what this does, it punishes me for having like any form of dissent and questioning, like why is my religion against me being gay and whatsoever? Why is my religion against a woman being a leader, right? So what this does into the debate, that this particular doctrine in big religion forces like one keeps us stagnant and doesn't allow social change, right? So the social change which we feel like any individual would want when it's like to their benefit becomes like what ideally taken out from this debate, right? So how is this brought about, right? The mechanism is simple. Big religion only puts in things such as questioning, equal to things such as what seem, right? So the impact of this argument becomes what we fall, right? Number one, it leads to like intellectual stagnation because oftentimes you realize when ideas are not like in principle with what big religions state, but they are okay with like a particular diversification of what society you come from, you realize that's not going to fly within what side opposition pushes for. But to the psychological harm brought about to individuals, because oftentimes when you're like, within this particular big religion groups and you want to, question and be like, why is this not allowed though it's okay from like my tribe perspective, you oftentimes realize you're going to be feeling things like guilt, fear, you're going to suffer things such as social exclusion. And also number three, this also now tends to hurt marginalized groups, right? So when it comes to that perception of harm, right? That would have to put them to believe that what this particular big religion favor everyone of particular descent favorably, right? But no, that's not the case. In points in time where you've seen like the Catholic Church being against women within what hierarchies of what leadership within like getting positions like the Pope, Bishop, right? And women who have like this dream that often terminated as seen as witches. When we see people like the youth not being allowed to have like chat, we feel that's enough perception of harm for us to want to what? Take away big religion, right? Now, number two, diluting the religion, right? They say that when you break down this big religion, you dilute the religion, right? three things they give you. Number one, smaller religions are going to want to buy in, right? Why do you feel that's comparatively untrue? By the time you have a lot of big religions such as Catholics, Islam, existing like within harmony and not like really trying to get in the circle with each other, we feel that if you have small religions, the same principle should be ideally validified, because we live in a society where we just have like a lot of people, right? So we feel that's not going to happen, right? The number two on the matrix of competition, we feel that's the same reason it wouldn't work, right? But the number two, the checks and balance system, right? Which they put in that when you have smaller religions, they don't have like a big structure to check and balance them out, right? Response to that. Number one, when you break down big religion, right? Oftentimes you realize now you give like your state better control over these groups of people, right? So at a point where these people decide to become radical and abuse power, it's either for like the government which already exists within a particular state to put the check and balance, right? But the number two, their particular idea becomes flawed. By the time when a big religion now becomes like detrimental and wants to use the coercive power to put in people, right? Oftentimes you realize the check and balance system now won't apply to that big religion, right? And then number two, comparatively, you don't have like particular attributes of the government being able to help them, right? So panel, how do we fix this entire problem, right? Number one, we encourage dialogue between people of religion, state governments, and we give government like particular credibility, because they're not being discouraged. Number two, we allow existence without fear. So we generally remove the perception of fear to marginalize groups of people. And then number two, I'll now lead into extension of the core principle in the debate, right? Core principle we run within our side of the debate is that A, we don't believe that an unelected institution should wield unchecked political and moral authority over people, right? Why is that so? Number one, they're not democratically accountable because they don't have any social contract which binds them to actually do what's right. And then number two, when you see the nature of this particular institution, this is someone who can just use divine authority to just mitigate whatever sort of criticism they get, right? But the number two, these are people to a degree who have ability to shape laws, gender roles, education, and culture, right? Now, why this particular principle we run is impactfully dangerous in the debate, right? Number one, because of the systemic harm it actually creates within the world, right? How does this systemic harm come about within the debate, right? Systemic harm comes in when, number one, these people have power to ideally change these particular structures and hurt marginalized groups. Number two, these people have leadership which is able to contest with actual leadership. So this looks like liberal leaders within the United States who want to actually talk about rights of other people being shut down and being viewed as evil, and them using their particular massive power to vote people, to have these people voted out of power. Then number three, when they get things such as tax exemption and so on, so it means these people are gaining a lot of money and are not giving it their fair particular aspect of contribution, right? So panel, why this particularly becomes detrimental to the debate, right? Number one, it takes away the entire aspect of accountability, right? Because these people are not really having responsibility. These people have power to actually shape narrative, but these people are not going to, are not being held accountable in case anything goes by due to things such as these people can only just delegitimize criticism as you're going against God, you're going to suffer moral condemnation, right? So panel, now why is that? Now, how our side helps actually achieve this better off on our side when you vote for the proposition bench, right? Number one, we feel that when these people want to talk about what the dangers which come when you break out such things, right? Oftentimes you realize what these groups stand for. The people who take over them are easily capable of decentralizing this thing, right? Number two, the wealth which is oftentimes going to be acquired now can be shared locally and transparently, right? Meaning these people now can actually use the religion to actually help their side actually stands for. And the number two, we feel leadership within these particular communities now becomes more representative, other than having someone who is born in Italy, being in charge of the entire Catholic Church, who doesn't have any particular affiliation to a farmer in Kabong who is suffering and has particular differences between the Catholic Church and his religion, but you just be painted as a demon to help them out, right? Now, panel. Finally, in my speech, the argumentation side protected time. Now, finally, final argument from side proposition, which win that's the debate, right? That is that when you have big religion, you entrench economic inequality through wealth and authority, right? How does this happen, right? Number one, it happens when you have these people being capable to ideally reinforce social classes through things such as education, through these people having math land, these people having teaching us doctrine such as sacrifice over sacrifice for the greater good of society. Meanwhile, what are they doing? They are again wealth through offering these people are sitting down within meeting and making laws which are favoring them. So like what this does to the people within society, right? Number one, you realize to the poor people who are just going to remain ideally caught down within the particular doctrine. Ideally, these people might not see any perception of harm, but you realize in the debate, we feel that when you're not able to like see the danger which is up ahead of you, we have like a right to at least get you out of it, right? So these people continuously get exploited, these people continuously get abused and so on, but they don't really have anything. So in someone we solve that case by simply having more representative leadership and not allowing people to have this much power. With that, I raise a proposition case.
Okay, thank you so much, Aito, for that fine speech. Let's have the second speaker from opposition bench here.
All right, hoping I'm audible.
Yeah, you are.
Okay. Let me just organize my notes real quick. And set up my timer. All right, I'll start this speech on my next word. For some reason, what happens within their world is that they only engage an aspect where the most utile religious practices actively exist, and they don't engage in a scenario where still conservative people still have the capacity to form religious sections that actively still marginalize people. We're able to show that in our worst case scenario, we're able to cater for vulnerable people since religion actively exists to maximize utility. We're very, very proud to be side opposition. A bit of engagement first. Let's just engage the agency charts that come from them. I think just because we all glamorize agency doesn't mean it's always so valuable. Given that agency is often traded off for more utile benefits, literally this is what happens within social contract. You trade off your freedom to move around any single time you want, or just perpetuate harms onto other people simply because there's a more utile benefit that exists, stuff like security and the like. Why is this valuable? I think the average intelligent voter says if more utile benefits actively accrue from the trade-off, then it's justifiable to trade off this agency. Why is it likely to accrue some level of utility? Three structural reasons here. I think Ryan is able to explain why it's likely you get much more unity within big religious groups. What this looks like is you have capacity to interact with more people that succumb to your same religious group. So you get much more unity. This is valuable for people because we explain people are much more social in nature. You have the need to form relationships with other people. You have the need to form interactions. We say in a world whereby you have big religious groups, the unity that's exclusively existed is what yields you some level of utility. But B, I think you get much more comfort and solace. Why? Because you have the capacity to appeal to a religion that actively gives you some level of joy, that gives you some level of solace, even when you're in a tough situation. This is why it becomes uniquely valuable, because there are lots of problems people succumb to. Problems existed within marginalization, as they say. Problems existent within capitalism. We say when religion in of itself exists, this is what gives you some level of utility. Why is this valuable? I think it justifies the trade-off on agency because you're able to at least accrue some mutual benefits. Let's also just chat about their whole stuff on accountability. I think this is contingent on whether religions don't exist within their world. I think they still do. I want to deposit stuff like random birth lottery, stuff like indoctrinative narratives outside religion still likely exist. So question, what happens when you're born as a gay person in a community that actively glamorizes conservative interpretations of that religion? Still actively marginalized within that world? There's no explanation as to why you still have the capacity to opt in, given that you still fear preemptive backlash that comes when you don't abide by these narratives. This is why they still largely lose on this debate. But they also chat lots about why you help vulnerable groups of people. I think my extension is going to prioritize that. Okay, but before I go into my extension, shoot your POI.
Okay, when a religion is broken down to smaller people versus when it's like a big international thing, where does the local government have where is it either for a local government hold the leaders accountable?
I think that's like where you really get it wrong, because now if you just say like state is going to overreach and hold leaders accountable, why isn't there state like incentive for state to just dictate what the religion ought to be? So it's the same thing you're saying within our world, but it's just state doing it. There's literally no nuance. And I think this is why like the extension largely becomes important, because it's going to explain what this is actually going to look like. My extension is going to focus on why breaking up big religions exacerbates polarization within religion itself. A, the creation of a bias that every subjective interpretation of a religion holds value. Why is it likely that this bias likely exists? A, the optic that exists within breaking up a big religion is that it aims to break objectivity. Notice, it becomes counterintuitive to their whole case to say that you don't want it to be subjective. So it has to be incredibly nuanced such that you get that subjective benefit. What does this actively look like? A, it looks like individual parties forming religious constitutions themselves based off their own individual interpretations. It looks like if I have enough capacity, enough resources, I can just go out and form my own religious constitution based off my subjective belief. But B, I also think it looks like if it's not individual perception, you likely form interpretations tied to other indoctrinative settings, i.e., you form a religious interpretation based off the culture you're in. Why? Your brain just finds it easier to align your religious belief with a culture that's actively indoctrinating. Why does this actively exacerbate a polarization? First, I want to note that this isn't a problem within homogeneous nations, but rather within heterogeneous nations, i.e., nations with a multiplicity of cultures. So it means people actively separate themselves to believe that this is a religion I ought to buy into simply because it aligns with my culture. C, interpretations now become a race to a top effect. This is what largely comes from Ryan's speech. By the way, we don't get lots of engagement on this. I think two things happen here. You form a race to a top effect based on stuff like resources and influence. Why? Ryan is able to explain why these groups largely have incentives to accrue buy-in. More structural reasons for this that come from my extension. A, indoctrinative power for a popular interpretation of a religion has to garner lots of buy-in. This buy-in becomes valuable for you because of the reasons Ryan gives you, as why probably accrue much more financial capacity, because you have the capacity to manipulate more people. This is literally what happens within Uganda. I don't know if you guys heard, but people are like backlashing Bujingo because he bought a border for his wife. This is like literally what happens when people have the capacity to use the indoctrinative power of a religion to manipulate people for funding. This is more likely, especially when you exist within capitalistic context existent within status quo. But B, I think there's a race for influence, simply competition for your belief to be like the most popular interpretation that exists. Why is this likely? I think A, the utility you derive when you have buy-in, the happiness you get when like your interpretation or your theory of religion has the most belief, and everybody says they're literally the founder of this belief and the like. This is what actively creates a race to a top effect where people want to garner much more value within their influence. D, I think also what happens within this world is that people become separated because they want to utilize the indoctrinative power of an interpretation to maximize their own individual utility. What does this look like? This is literally what proposition argues for. A, it looks like politicization of religion, i.e., using it to empower a minority group you're in. But I also think they just chat about why it's good for vulnerable people. I think the flip also happens. Why? It looks like conservative groups using an interpretation to empower themselves. What are the impacts here? I think the things that likely happen are twofold. A, you either get a superseding interpretation, or B, you still have a lot of interpretations that exist, so a multiplicity of interpretations that exist within the world, and people have less incentive to interact with each other because it will break their subjective belief. Why is it bad to have a superseding interpretation? But first, why is it likely that one exists? And I'm like, pay a lot of attention here because this is valuable. I think it's likely that a superseding interpretation exists for two structural reasons here. A, is perpetuated by the most influential people that exist, i.e., people with lots of social capital, people who are like very influential within status quo, have garnered a lot of popularity that they can influence people to just buy into their interpretation. But B, it constantly changes to appeal to what people find more utile, like what people garner more happiness from. If people garner more happiness from saying that probably I should be gay, if people garner more happiness from saying I should beat my mom, these are things religion actively changes for, such that it gains much more influence as a superseding interpretation. Why is this bad? Ryan argues you make religion malleable. I just want to extend on this impact here. On principle, you lose what religion ought to be about. And I think this is the most valuable thing that has to exist in the debate. Religion isn't about what will give you more happiness, but it's simply about what's more moral. It's simply about what's much more right. It's much more right to say that we shouldn't lie. It's much more right to say that we shouldn't steal. In a world whereby stealing actively becomes popularized and religion shapes to believe that, we think that in of itself harms the sustainability of religion. But B, I think we also chat about why it still harms other subjective interpretations. Because for some reason within their world, they feel like everybody's
Okay, thank you so much, Speaker, for that fine speech. Let's have the third speaker from Proposition 20 here.
Confirm that I'm audible.
Yeah, you're loud and clear.
Okay. Let me just set my personal timer. I'll begin shortly. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Even if North Korea has a good dictator, people still continuously say that country is bad because that dictator infringes on the people's rights to choice. The only idea you get from opposition is, hey, we are most likely able to trade off such things to the extent to which we give religion meaning and plausibility. First thing I want to engage on is in the idea of unity. I think the idea of unity and comfort in terms of solace are all based on the idea that we don't have religion existing outside of the house. It speaks to the extent to which people are still able to be united within their communities, because I don't think you're going to be proximately united with someone from America just because you follow the same religion. They don't really care about you. They don't necessarily interact with you so much. If you're still able to still have unity within a particular community where individuals interact so much with themselves, I think we still are able to achieve all those particular benefits they argue with the idea of unity. Things like comfort and solace, I think those only come in if you are able to prove that we don't have religion outside of the house. We prove to you that religion becomes more concentrated within a particular community, and it's all about the voluntary involvement of individuals in that community. You still are able to have comfort in terms of solace. Second thing, talk about the idea that the marginalized marginalization still happens in society because the norms still exist when you're a gay person born in a society that accept that norm still challenges you. I think the difference here is we have ability to necessarily go on and challenge that norm as individuals. Yes, we still have marginalization in outside the house, but the ability for us to go on and challenge that and hold individuals accountable for necessarily perpetuating such marginalizing norms is equally higher, because we don't believe they have doctrine authority to go on and say that doing this is something that is right or doing this is something that is wrong. We go on to question it and necessarily go on to necessarily hold those individuals accountable. On their side, comparatively, it is worse, because if that norm exists and the religion says being gay is wrong, and I'm in that particular society, I don't even have the ability to go on and challenge it. In the worst case scenario, you don't get a better society because there's no way for you to necessarily get any liberation on that particular prospect. The idea that the religions we're going to create are going to be based on things like culture and your brain interpretation, I think this is wrong, because even the priests that are currently existing use doctrine books to necessarily go on and explain particular context. I think those books still exist. We don't have the ability to someone to come and say, my religion is called religion Fahad, and we're necessarily going to be able to necessarily do that. People are rational. They're based on things like concrete proof to go on and necessarily believe in a particular thing. At the end of it all, that ability for them to necessarily think rationally reduces because of the coercive power these religions have. On our side, the rationality of individuals necessarily goes on to increase because the religion does not become about one central figure at the end who is the Pope, who is making particular laws about our religion. It becomes about what the doctrine books really say. Individuals are necessarily going to gather in societies and are able to necessarily interpret interpret those books for what they really say, not necessarily believing what one particular central individual necessarily talks about in a particular prospect. The idea that an influential individual is going to come and become the one who leads the religion, I think this is not true, because if individuals voluntarily gather, it speaks to the extent to which they're not susceptible to things like manipulation. But even if they were to be, it was to be true that someone influential comes up and he becomes the leader of our religion, we still have the ability to hold them accountable. We still have the ability to necessarily hold them accountable if they make a law that necessarily damages us. If they necessarily go on to say that gay rights are not necessarily important, we go on to necessarily question what they are necessarily talking about, because we don't have belief. They have that authoritarian, that divine belief in the end of it all. I think it becomes important, even in the best case where influential people are the ones who are going to lead these religions, we still have a ability to question them. We have a better society that can be created. Talk about the idea what religion is all about.
speech. I don't think that these groups are going to have an incentive in any way to continuously marginalize individuals, and yet their relevance is contingent on those individuals buying. I think there needed to be more analysis as to why these religions even have that incentive in the first place. Now, why? I think that there's still a level of consent that exists. Even if we were to concede to the fact that they're going to marginalize people and do these things, I think there's a level of consent that still exists. People who feel marginalized can simply opt out of these religions. And I'm going to engage the structures that come in first speech on how they generally force them to stay in them and all these things. But you see, the thing is, Ryan is able to prove to you that there are structures today that make people feel like it's okay to move away. Notice that there is even a rise in atheism, in status quo. That means that there are structures today that glorify your own self-actualization, your own self-preservation. If you feel that these things are being going against, it's very easy for individuals to opt out in society. Now notice, this is likely symmetric. When they argue that they're going to have the solution to this creating smaller religions or smaller sections that are not adherent to one individual body, they don't in any way explain how the indoctrinative power of religion is then stopped. I think if we're still basing on the same principles and people have a large buy-in to these principles and attachment to these things, if you're still just going to solve this by breaking up this big religion, but religious practice still exists on their side, that means the indoctrinative and coercive power that they try to argue on their side is still going to exist. Now, I think that shows you that because these things are largely symmetric, the debate just can't be judged on that particular metric. What then has to become the metric to judge the debate is on the exclusive danger of deciding to do these things. I'm going to give you two exclusive dangers that their side gives us. The first, okay, before I do that, let me get you, Davis, your POI.
Okay, if religions are willing to change because of the people around them, then just terminate your entire case, which goes on the frame that these big religious groups have like set principles when they're willing to change them anytime.
What I'm trying to show you is that your argument is largely symmetric. If you claim that religions cannot change in any way, you don't explain to us in any of your analysis why breaking them up is what solves the issue. That's what I'm trying to show you. Now, I'm giving you two exclusive dangers of their side. The first is that they break up communities. This comes within second speech. Glen explains it, but they don't in any way rebut it, even in their third speech. But secondly, I think you reduce doctrinal accountability. This is important, independent of state accountability. They're able to explain to you why they get state accountability on their side. We don't agree with that. But what we tell you is that it's even more important that we have some sort of doctrinal checks and balances. This comes within first speech. We tell you things that state would not be concerned with, we are concerned with, and we think that these things need to be handled. Why is it important to have doctrinal accountability independent of state accountability? I think the fact and the analysis they give us on how religion is largely manipulative and coercive creates an incentive for why the doctrines being preached in church need to be revised, need to be continuously looked into. The manipulation that exists creates a large incentive for people to actually do radicalism. I think this analysis comes in Glen's speech and in Ryan's speech, and it's already explained. I think there needs to be how they explain how they achieve doctrinal accountability. Now, let me handle the idea of accountability that they bring and front within the debate. I think the first thing that they sort of try to run is the coercive power that unelected officials have. But this is a simple response. Notice that even within status quo, power by unelected officials still exists to some extent. The thing is, it cannot be actualized if these people don't have buy-in. What happens is that we still have people like celebrities who still have power in some way or the other to do these things because coercive power just exists. They don't explain how religious coercive power is independently bad. But secondly, on the level of consent that exists, I think you need to analyze society today. You notice that religions are largely popular within areas that are already conservative. That means that these people just decided to join these religions. I think in more liberal areas, we've seen people letting go of these religions and opting out. This is analysis to show you why most countries are even secular in the first place. This shows you that people can easily opt out of these religions, and the structures they claim are largely being gone against in present day. But the third thing, I think it's largely symmetric. Notice that if religious practice is still going to exist on their side, just with breakups, I think still people who adhere to these religions can take power and sort of create this coercive power and do these things that they're trying to explain in this debate. Now, what then needs to happen in this debate? I think OP then needs to prove to us how you take away power from them exclusively by breaking up these big religions. I think breaking up these big religions doesn't solve any of the problems that they mentioned in the debate as long as religious practice is still happening. They had no burden in this debate to defend or to try to explain to us how religious practice is going to stop existing. I think when it still exists, all the harms they claim are going to happen. Now, why do we think that accountability is better achieved on our side? And this is analysis we already provide. I think when you have a larger organization, you have lots of people from different contexts. That means that you have a larger capability of questioning certain things to a larger extent, have debate and have discourse. I think when you have less people involved, that is a smaller church and it's independent and no one can even advise that particular church, you have a bigger polarization existing on your side because there is not going to be any actual discourse that's going to happen within a small society led by a single pastor. You see, they tell us that we have one big pope, but realize we have thousands of cardinals and all these sorts of things. What they have is one pastor who has complete control of his church with absolutely no checks and balances. They don't defend how accountability exists in such a world that this pastor can simply create a doctrinally wrong thing or can just do something to manipulate his crowd to his benefit, something that state cannot save them from, and no one's going to help those individuals. I think that's dangerous. And it becomes very, very absurd when within Davis's speech, he talks about how local governments can hold smaller groups accountable. I think that's largely symmetric because they don't understand how big religions work. Big religions largely have these smaller churches that exist in these things. I think the marginal benefit here is that if a church is clearly doing something that's wrong, and this analysis you get from Glen, that things that are wrong are generally known as wrong. These big institutions have an incentive to remain moral because that's how they got by in the first place. I think they'll be able to apply pressure on these particular churches that are doing something that's wrong, these particular mosques that are doing something that's wrong. I think the marginal benefit here is that the pressure is more likely to be effective if it's applied on two fronts, on a doctrinal front and on a state front. I think that's the marginal benefit we get. We reduce manipulation to its actual limit, and we reduce indoctrinative power to its actual minimum when we do this thing. But secondly, I think the other marginal benefit you get on our side is that you reduce the chance for state repression of these particular individuals. Notice that it would be much easier for radical countries such as Iran, and I think when they try to make us argue about theocracies and how power and how all these things exist, I think Ryan already takes this out in his frame. He tells you we're not defending theocracies. In fact, most of these large and big religions go against theocracies. They don't actually accept or go with these things. I think what happens, and this is the analysis that Glen gives you on unity, if that unity is broken down, it means that people who are oppressed because of their religious beliefs really have no one that they can run to because they are only affiliated to one church. That analysis becomes so important because it shows you that individuals are now actively being marginalized for their religious beliefs on their side of the house. It becomes very dangerous, and I think that needs to be something that they should have responded to within the debate. I rest.
Okay, thank you so much, Speaker, for the fine speech. We now come to the end of the first half of the debate. Let's have either the first or second speaker from a negative bench to give the reply speech. Here.
Hope I'm audible.
Yes, you're loud and clear.
Right, let me set my timer. Okay. I don't think that for some reason people likely get most of the benefits they get within their world. I think most of the benefits they say within their speeches are largely symmetric, as Titus is able to show. What happens within their world is that they get no exclusivity, but rather worsen the problems that likely exist within status quo that are very, very proud side with side opposition. The way I'll structure this reply speech is in three ways. First, I'll give engagement to a positive matter and just show why our responses were better. Secondly, why our matter was largely not responded to or why the responses from them were insufficient. Thirdly, just a chat about strategy, i.e. maybe engagement or how the round just generally. Okay, the first chat is on accountability. I want to note that this was dependent on whether people want to hold you accountable. The analysis here is that doctrines no longer exist, so people have the capacity to hold you accountable. This was a lie. Why? The bulk of my extension shows why inevitably a superseding interpretation likely exists. The analysis I give here was twofold. First, it's set up by influential people. But secondly, to their own concession, they exist to maximize utility. So subjective interpretations that likely maximize the most utility likely supersede. Why is this important? These interpretations likely have a lot of indoctrinative power because they accrue from narratives that actively glamorize the util benefit that exists within them. So it looks like your mom saying that you should buy into this interpretation because it gives you more solace, it gives you more joy. What Titus is able to explain on the comparatives is that within our world, at least there's some level of capacity for discourse and call out. Why? Because there's a multiplicity of people that opt into the same general religion. So there's more capacity for call out for things that are actively harmful. There's no no engagement that goes onto that response. But the second chart is about how you help vulnerable groups of people. We deposit that the reason as to why you lack agency likely exists within random birth lottery. What happens when you are born within a conservative society that actively glamorizes a superseding interpretation that says gays are bad? What happens then? The response intuitively is you opt out. However, there's no reasoning as to why within Rand's frame, as to why things like maybe atheism or opt-out mechanisms that are likely becoming viable still don't exist. I think the only bit of analysis here is that the doctrines still likely are available. I think we explain why doctrines still likely exist even within smaller religion groups. There's no any bit of engagement that goes to that substantive matter. But I also explain why a new metric of vulnerability comes out, i.e., your subjective interpretation not having any buy-in. So you feel like what you are interpreting the religion to be is nonsense, or what you actively thought should give you more utility from a religion is actively being diminished because you don't accrue buy-in. I think why Rand's speech became heavily important is because he shows you why these people do care about buy-in. I also think I chat about it within my extension as to why like influence is very relevant for these people, but also ranches about why financial capacity that accrues exclusively for more buy-in is important. Let's go into our charts. Rand just gives you a simple chart as to why religion ought not to be malleable. The analysis he gives you, even Titus chats about it within third, is that religion ought not to change simply just because of what's more trendy or the subjective things people view to give them more utility. Why? Because he says religion doesn't depend on what's like so utile, but depends on what's right, on what's moral and what's ethical. We deposit that given that religion constantly changes, it reduces the sustainability it has, it reduces the amount of relevance it ought to have within status quo. There's a bit of engagement that comes to this from Fahad's speech. Fahad just says that, yeah, at least we gain some benefit for people because they can like pray to the Lord in the way that they want. We say that's not valuable, given that you're degrading the essence of religion in of itself and the reasons as to why it was founded. I think let's just chat about strategy now. I think firstly, there was little to no engagement matter that comes from my speech within Fahad's speech. What he did here is just nitpick the reasons I gave. There ought to be analysis to show why the polarization that actively exists within the breaking down of a big religion is somehow
Okay, thank you, speaker, for that speech. Let's have the final speaker for the round. Here.
Yeah. Glen said my time, but then I'll start. Okay. I think the bulk of my reply speech is going into probably clarity on what our side of the world looks like. Because I think the claims on engagement are entirely dependent on the fact that they entirely understood what we were saying. And then after that, we failed to respond, given that there's a lot of things that spiraled within this debate. I think heavily I'm going to rely on like basic parts of my speech and why still they become, if they were engaged within their side, they are minimally engaged. I'm going to start with the idea on what exactly this looks like. Firstly, I want to note that the idea of I just want to note why the idea of like diluting like religion doesn't work already. There are already a lot of nuances that exist. This is something that comes to my speech. There are already a lot of nuances that come within like religion. That is to say, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, and whatever it is that exists within status quo. However, the way that those nuances exist as big blocks within like status quo and everything. Being that those big blocks exist, it means that there's a wide accessibility and like buying into all of them. Given that analysis, why it becomes extremely bad for them to exist as they are is because in the event that you'd like to challenge things, it becomes very problematic. How? You simply delegitimize these people as probably wrong, as probably immoral. The idea is simple. To respond to this, they say that all things like atheism exist because of things like they lose the opt out of specific things and everything. Notice people consider atheists as bad. There's active demonization of you opting into things like atheism because the idea is that things like morality are good. Simply delegitimizing somebody's response to like something about religion as atheism is what actively prevents people from actively checking, like holding these people accountable. But I think the second idea, but I think the second idea would come from like maybe Jesus' speech and everything. people have nowhere to run. They can't live without fear, because in big groups you often end up being demonized. Being that you're unable to being that you have all those sorts of fear means you're less likely to opt out of the religion, even if you want to. You lose out on things like agency and everything. Their second chart is on things like unity. That unity doesn't exist. I think what I say in my speech is that religion is simply just a sheep-like following of what you believe is the best of the Pope, Prophet Muhammad, of each and every single doctrine, because probably mommy and daddy taught you from a very young age that you're supposed to believe in a specific religion. Given that analysis, why do we become better? Comparatively, we become better. Somebody is able to opt into spirituality rather than religion. That is to say, I get to pray, and I get to pray to like a God that I believe in. Their simple idea is to exaggerate and say that I'm going to be immoral. I'm simply just going to like opt out of things like morality because the religion becomes subjective. I think it's simple. We provide a lot more people with agency to probably do things like pray without the idea of praying 5 times a day like the doctrine teaches. You get the idea, the ability to like pray without having to recite the novena, or without having to count like 50 beads like within Catholicism and everything. The third idea is on how even these leaders still then end up like losing this religion for the sake of doing things like appealing to a lot more people. The entire point of religion is simple: because I ought to get some sort of fulfillment. How do I get that fulfillment? I get that fulfillment because I'm able to opt into these things, because I'm able to like believe in a specific religion. I'm able to like believe in God as a specific deity as opposed to the religion, rather than tolerating the doctrines that I'm taught by things like the Pope, or by things like the deities. But the last thing I want to point out is on how we get accountability. The idea is because you have very small groups of people, you're less likely going to have accountability, because a pope can simply like come and dictate whatever happens within those small communal-based religions. Obligation becomes extremely proximity dependent. That analysis is what comes from my speech, which I think got engaged in the entire debate. Being that obligation becomes extremely like proximity dependent, because you're close to that specific person, or because you're close to that group of people, because of things like communitarianism, you're less likely going to do things like harm them. Given all that analysis, I believe we win the debate. Because given that analysis, I think we win the debate, and you also see the ballot proposition.
Okay, thank you guys so much for that interesting round. Judges, please can we meet in the deliberation room so that we can have a chat.
Hello? Sam?